Yan, hello teachers and good afternoon po. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat who are here joining us live no for our last episode of our March series no, and we definitely reserve no the best for last for our March series for this month no teachers. Okay, but before we start, I'd like to first no greet our teachers who are in our chat right now. No, napakainit po by the way. Sana po we are all staying hydrated no. So good afternoon to Pastor Manny Garcia. Blessed afternoon po as always. Teacher Miyuki de Malanta. Welcome back, Teacher Miyuki. Para naging busy rin tayo, no? Teacher Maan Tapawan. Teacher Mary Chris Cerebrano. Teacher Joy Kenneth Biasong. Teacher Lai Ra. Teacher Jeneline Kabahog. Teacher Carmelin Perez, Teacher I, Oka, Teacher Arlene Alberto, yes, Teacher Tuaha, okay, Teacher Eric Naval, Teacher Petit, okay, Teacher Mary Joy Cadava, Teacher Marian Joy Altar, Sir Alex Javier Alvarez, Teacher Gemma Rivera, Teacher Edlin Ortiz, Teacher Crew Mel, Teacher Dean Clifford Huame, Teacher Neri Villa, Teacher Alan Brutas are here, who's here in Antipolo. No, by the way, if those who, anyone who's interested in small business um, opportunities, no, I think Sir Alan is offering something. Please do message him, no, in Facebook as well. Okay, Teacher Christine Dantes, Teacher Michelle Ortega, okay, Teacher Joras Michael Bongkarawan, Teacher Beverly Joy Coahao, Teacher Grace Carduque, Teacher Cecil Spirito from University of Makati, Teacher Maribel Intea, Teacher Elda Gonzalez, Teacher Janet B. Recalde, Teacher Giselle Higante, Teacher Maribel Umambak, Teacher, of course, Teacher Dalia Rioma of Davao City, no? Yes, I miss Davao City, no? Kasi may program kami dyan before that we run from in our school, no? That visits Davao City. Sana mabalik namin yun. Okay, anyway, magandang hapon po, teachers, sa inyong lahat, and welcome to our session for today. Okay, and our session for today will still be about assessments, as we have, no, for the last few Saturdays. Okay, we began with promoting integrity and honesty in assessments, and then we tackled on ICT based assessments, integrating technology in assessments, and last week, no, we had a session on authentic assessments using the PBL framework, okay, and the PBL design. Okay? And that's now we're going to culminate, no, our March series, okay, with evaluating assessments, understanding validity, reliability, and effectivity, no, or effectiveness of assessments. Siguro napakahalaga for teachers, no, sa ating lahat, no, na hindi lang tayo makapag-design ng assessments, hindi lang tayo makapag-collect ng data, no. Dapat lagi din natin iniisip, no, gaano nga ba ka-effective, ka-valid, no, or ka-reliable yung mga assessment tools natin, kasi those are supposed to be, no, able to give us that much data to impact learning. Okay? Kasi yun minsan naging misconception about assessment, no? That assessments become the end goal of education or learning. Okay? Well, in fact, it should not be, no? It should be like a continuous tool that we use over and over in order to impact education. And that's what we're going to talk about today. No? How do we actually look at, no, and evaluate assessments, no, and see how we can further improve them, no, by design. Okay, and I have the honor, no, to present our speaker for today. Okay, very very close. Okay, one of my mentors in my school, and have guided me, no, all throughout my years in Saver School, no, for the last 15 years, no, 10 years, no. Okay, kasi 15 years ako total, and then yung 5 years ko was in grade school. Okay, so I'd like to introduce briefly, okay, our speaker for today. Okay, not someone new, no, because have been in Kaagapay teacher support already before. Okay, our speaker for today, Mr. Exxon Ryan Yu, is a graduate of Ateneo de Manila University with a degree in BS Management. He acquired his Master of Arts in Education major in Basic Education, teaching for the same from the same institution. Currently, he is the junior high school assistant principal for academics at Saver School. Let us welcome into our stream Sir Exxon Ryan Yu. Sir Exxon, good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon Franco. Good afternoon po sa lahat. Magandang hapon. Isang mainit na Sabado sa ating lahat.
Napakainit sa Exxon. So hopefully, okay din po kayo dyan, no? At you're keeping staying hydrated. No? Anyway, Sir Exxon, siguro lang na bago tayo mag-start for our session for today, okay, is to ask, no, ano nga ba yung cover natin for today's session, and how this session, no, would be important for our teachers.
Okay, good afternoon. Yeah. So Franco, I think you were right in saying it's the listening to the stream of assessment topics that you talked about for the past few months now. This past few weeks, this month in March. This assessment session, I think we'd like to focus on what is the purpose of assessment, and tama yung sinabi mo kanina na assessment is not the end goal, 'di ba? It's continuing process that helps us teachers help our students do better. Siyempre ang sanay tayo, iniisip natin assessment, yun na yung test, tapos na, 'di ba? But it's actually an ongoing process. And so, yun yung what we'd like to share with everyone, maybe some insights, some ideas. Of course, there are a lot of ideas about assessment, but here are some of the ideas that we'd like to share about how we can make our assessments valid and reliable. Um, it's not going to be a test construction workshop, ano, kasi iba yon. But we will talk about certain things about it, mention some things about it, maybe remind each other about these things. At naaral natin to lahat siguro sa ating mga edu classes before. And also share some insights, my personal insights about assessment, and that maybe can guide us also.
Thank you. Maraming salamat, Sir Exxon. And we are definitely excited no, for your session. So teachers, just final reminder before we I turn the floor to Sir Exxon, that this is a certified session. You'll be given as an evaluation link that you'll answer to be able to get the certificate no, for this particular session. Okay. Again, enjoy the session, Sir Exxon. Good luck on your session. I'll be in the chat, no, also interacting with our teachers.
Okay, thank you very much, Franco. Again, good afternoon to everyone. It's nice to be here once again to really be with fellow educators as we talk about things that will help improve education for our students. So the topic we'd like to talk about this afternoon is evaluating assessments. So by evaluating, well, for one, we create our own assessments, but maybe one thing we'd like to think about also is are our assessments really valid? Are they supposed to measure what they're supposed to measure? So for those of us who are teachers, and I think there are most of us, or not all of us, are teachers, this is one way to look at our assessments and review them and say, valid nga ba ito? Tama nga ba itong assessment natin? For some of us who may be in administrative roles, maybe as heads, department heads, assistant principals, or principals who review the assessments of teachers, this might also be helpful to guide us in uh, checking, validating the assessments of our teachers. Again, the end goal is not so much to create the best test or the best assessment, but rather an assessment that will really measure the outcomes that we want our students to exhibit, to show through the assessment. Okay, so please bear with me. The first part, I will just share with you some insights, some principles that that can guide us before we go to into some a bit more specific tips and guides. Okay, so maybe something that we can think about first. This comic strip is quite interesting because if we think about it in the context of assessment, diba, uh, all our students are also very different. They have different learning styles. They have different capabilities. And so how do we create assessments that will at least cover the general spectrum of our students? So it's very important that when we create our assessments, we take into consideration the context of our students and also how they learned, what they learned from us, and perhaps how they're able to communicate what they learned from us. So, kayo, Chers, tayo, Chers, what is our perspective of assessment? Ganito ba? Na iisang type ng assessment, bahala ka na sa buhay mo, 'di ba? Paano yung isda? Paano siya aakyat sa puno kung ang assessment ay pag-akyat sa puno, 'di ba? So, this is something that we can think about as we design and look at our assessments, evaluate assessments if necessary. So, first thing that we'd like to ask is why do we do what we do? Meaning, why do we do these assessments? Why do we prepare these assessments, or why do we need to review these assessments? I'd like us to think about 6 common misunderstandings about assessment of learning. Okay, so I'll just go through each one, and as I go through each one, I invite you to think about your own ideas of assessment. And do you agree or disagree with this? Okay, so some of these might be very debatable. So our point now is not to debate about this, but just to show that there are some misunderstandings or even some different perspectives about assessment. So the first one, assessment and evaluation are the same. So I think this is a common misunderstanding because as Franco mentioned earlier, teacher Franco mentioned earlier, assessments is supposed to be an ongoing process while evaluation is the end result. So when we look at our students, I hope that we are not just evaluating our students, but we're actually assessing their learning that progresses. So assessment versus evaluation, they may sometimes be used interchangeably, but they're actually not the same. Next, most assessment is summative. Yes, they will say, okay, test natin yan. It tests the learning of our students. But hopefully, as we mentioned earlier, assessments are a continuous process. Is part of our assessments are part of a continuing process. So that's why right now, especially if we look at education trends, one important trend right now is the focus on formative assessments, not just on summative assessments. Because actually, formative assessments, we can argue, are in fact more important than the summative assessments because that's what leads our students to the summative assessments. If they don't do well in our formative assessments, then how do we expect them to do well in the summative assessments? Therefore, for us teachers, we need to craft our summative assessments well. We need to prepare our summative assessments well so that they actually help our students get to where we want them to go. Next, assessment is one way of communication. It's a one-way communication, sorry. The teacher gives feedback on student work. Well, that's usually the process that we have. But in fact, they say assessment for it to really be effective has to be a two-way street. It has to be a conversation. The student has the capacity to also ask, clarify, and it can be triangulated, in fact, because we can have peer assessment where another student gives the one who works on his assessment or the one who made the assessment, took the assessment, get feedback about his assessment. Assessment is for grading purposes only. I hope by now we know na it's not just for grading, but it's really more for the learning and testing or seeing how the students learned and how much they learned or how much they did not learn. So it will tell us what to do, how to go about the next steps. Next, all student work should be given a grade or a mark. So this is very debatable again, but it's considered a common misunderstanding because they say not all assessments need to be graded because in fact if assessments are progressive, meaning that we are helping our students get better through assessments, then obviously they will have to start from a place where they don't know much or they don't know anything. Therefore, if we grade that, then paano yun? Mababa ang grade nila because wala silang alam dun sa simula. So maybe it's the important thing is in your own schools, maybe you'd like to think about which assessments really need to be part of the grade to showcase how much of their performance really is reflected in that grade. And are if assessments are late, the teacher should deduct points. This is one big misconception they're saying because if we deduct points for anything like being late or uh, poor handwriting or dirty work, it actually does not measure the grade that we will give or the feedback that we will give will not be a measure of what the assessment is really checking unless it's a penmanship assessment, diba? What if it's an essay and we're not actually testing penmanship? Of course we know penmanship is important to understand what is written, but if hindi yon naintindihan tas binawasan natin ng points kasi hindi natin maintindihan, tama nga ba yon? Tama nga ba na ang grade na makuha niya ay reflective of what he or she how she or she performed in that assessment? So here are some 6 common misunderstandings about assessment of learning. Okay, so you let's again think about our practices and see, do they fall under each one of these or is there something we need to think about further? So another thing is, therefore, have we seen some of these misunderstandings in our teaching or in the teaching practice in general? So very interesting, no? Sometimes we say, pag naturo ko na, if I taught it to my students, I can assess it. And if they don't know, if they don't do well in that assessment, it tells me as a teacher that they did not learn it. Ganun nga ba? Is that always the perspective that we will take? So again, this comic strip is quite interesting, no? It says, I taught Stripe how to whistle pertaining to the dog. And the other kid says, I don't hear him whistling. And the other one said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. Ganyan ba? Sana hindi ganyan ang ating perspective sa mga students. I taught him addition and subtraction, pero hindi to marunong mag-add and mag-subtract. Well, I didn't say he learned it, I just said I taught it. As teachers, what is important to us? And that's why it always ties up to the idea of assessments. Here, therefore, are some beliefs on educational assessment. I will not go through each one, but I think some of these statements speak for themselves and actually talk about very important things that we consider when we prepare and even evaluate assessments. So first, effective assessment improves student learning. Effective assessment recognizes learning differences. That's the example I gave earlier dun sa puno, di ba? The task of climbing a tree. But what if some of our students are not able to climb that tree? So how do we consider that? Effective assessment measures what is truly valued, what's important, what is really important in our lesson. Effective assessment is, of course, valid, and we know that validity and reliability, which we'll talk about in a little while as well. Effective assessment is fair and ethical. It will not ask students to treat others unfairly or to go against principles, moral principles and ethics. Effective assessment is efficient and feasible, meaning that taking an assessment should not be very, very difficult on the student such that it really makes the student have a hard time and therefore will not be able to showcase how he learned or she learned in a certain topic. Diba? Hindi natin pahirapan. Halimbawa, sobrang bubuksan pa muna, ang daming bubuksan, ang daming pages na ito-turn bago makita yung actual assessment. So, hindi ganon. It's not supposed to be that way. Of course, that's an extreme example. Effective assessment promotes learner self-reliance. The goal of assessments is to really make the student be self-reliant and not to rely on teachers or tutors or their parents or their older brothers and sisters to help them. Effective assessment is, of course, authentic and contextual. I think you touched on this earlier last week. I think when you talked about one way to make authentic assessments, project-based learning. So that's one example. And contextual, it's in the context of our students. Oops, sorry. And a few more beliefs on educational assessment. Effective assessment is congruent with instruction. Congruent meaning that it's aligned with instruction. Again, with the example earlier of the comic strip, it's not because not just because we were able to talk about it or we taught it in class, then we can assess it. Or we talk about a certain topic and then yung assessment is 2, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times more challenging or difficult than what we taught them. Definitely, it's not congruent. It's not aligned with the instruction. And therefore, we might see some of our students or many of our students not performing well. Effective assessment is based on authentic tasks, right? So again, authenticity, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and also looking back at your PBL session last week. Effective assessment uses a wide range of tools and methods. Yes, for us to be able to see the overall learning of our students, we have to employ a mix of different types of assessment tools. Some of them may be quite basic, testing the rote knowledge and skills of students. Some may be a little bit more higher order, and maybe at the end of it, we'd like to test something we'd like to assess something that will showcase their transfer of learning. Effective assessment is based on criteria that students know and understand. So rubrics are very important. And I think Teacher Franco will talk about rubrics more later on. No? So very important that students know how they are going to be marked and graded and understand how that will be done. And effective assessment is a collaborative process involving students in most cases, of course, especially authentic assessments. Of course, if it's a pen and paper test, syempre we don't expect them to collaborate, no? Iba na yon. But the idea here is that in general, if we want effective assessment, there has to be some collaborative nature because it is one important 21st century skill. Effective assessment focuses on what students have learned and can do. Again, the goal of assessment is not to find out what students do not know and what they cannot do, right? Hindi natin hahanapan ng butas Ano ang hindi niya alam, ito ang itetest ko. That is not how assessment works, because assessment is supposed to be to test or to showcase what students learned and what they know and what they can do. And as we mentioned, effective assessment is ongoing and continuous. That is why when we create our lessons and unit plans, lesson plans, assessments need to be placed in critical points so that we are able to check for understanding and for learning throughout the entire learning process or throughout the entire unit. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, formative assessments are also very, very important. In fact, some would argue more important. So here are some beliefs on educational assessment, and that's why I started with that, because we just want to be able to lay out some groundwork as we talk about assessments further. So then a few more concepts, promise, a little more na lang, and then we will talk about some practical tips. No, how can we help our students learn better? Okay, so just to summarize this, the next few slides are quite text heavy. Sorry for that, but we just wanted to showcase very important things about assessment for learning. Highlighting here that assessment for learning turns day-to-day assessment into a teaching and learning process. As we said, assessment is not just the end, but assessment is part of the teaching and learning process. That enhances student learning, not just tests student learning. Okay, that's why they're saying effective assessment or creating and therefore evaluating the assessments well so that they become effective, valid, and reliable is very important. Assessment for learning begins when teachers share achievement targets to let our students know what is expected of them, what their goals are, and how they can reach those goals. Presenting those expectations in student-friendly language accompanied by examples of exemplary work. We want to give them exemplars. What does it look like to do well in this assessment? So we also give them examples. So they really know how to get there. Then, frequent self-assessments provide students and teachers with continual access to descriptive feedback. Very important. Okay, in fact, a new word right now that's coming up is feed forward, not just feedback, because feedback is more on the past, right? So, example, you can say here, feedback. Your statement here, this paragraph is unclear, right? Or the point here is not very clear. So that's feedback. But in terms of feed forward, we'd like it to move forward. So what then if that paragraph is not clear? So a feed forward might be you may want to include one or two examples to clarify your point here. So that is feed forward. So the student knows what to do, how to go about it, how to become better. The student's role is to strive to understand what success looks like and to use the feedback or the feed forward from each assessment to discover where they are at this point so that they can move forward. And this goes even for simple assessments. It's not just for quite elaborate or authentic assessments. Even sometimes our pen and paper tests or essays can be very, very important tools to provide feedback, feed forward to our students. And assessment for learning provides both students and teachers with understandable information in a form that they can use immediately to improve performance. For example, in math, if I'm given two or three important drills and two of those I got correct and the last one I did not do correctly, if that is discussed properly, then I will know exactly how to improve in the next one, right? Or for this one, you did not simplify your answer, or you made an error in factoring this part, or you were very careless. It was a very simple problem. You were already correct. You just did your last operation of subtraction incorrectly. So that those very concrete ways will help them improve their performance. Therefore, when we use assessment for learning, assessment becomes far more than merely a one-time event. Again, not just the end, not just the culmination, stuck onto the end of an instructional unit. Rather, assessment becomes a series of interlaced experiences that enhance the learning process by keeping students confident and focused on their progress, even in the face of occasional setbacks or challenges. So when they do not do so well in an assessment, it just tells them what they need to work on and how they can improve on this. So again, these are some ideas, concepts about assessment, which our hope is that we imbibe, we think about, and we employ when we prepare our assessments, and particularly in this session, is when we look at assessments, we evaluate the assessments that are already created. So whether we created them on our own and we'd like to review them, or we are maybe administrators looking at the assessments of other teachers. So just to summarize, the goal of assessment for learning is not to eliminate failure, but rather to keep failure from becoming chronic, paulit-ulit, and thus inevitable in the mind of the learner. So the goal of assessment is to identify maybe some parts that the student needs to work on and improve on, and therefore find ways to improve on that. So again, failure will always be part of the process because as I mentioned, at the start of it, obviously they will not do so well. But when we're, for example, teaching them something complicated, let's say we introduce trigonometry in mathematics, and the first few assessments, formative assessments, students may definitely not do so well in because they're not very familiar with it. So not the goal of the assessment of learning is not to eliminate that part of failing, not doing well, but rather through those assessments, it is really to keep that failure from happening over and over again because they are learning from that process. So that being said, what then do we do? How then do we look at the assessments that we have created or that are created that we want to improve on? Here are some basic guides that I'd like to share. Again, there are many, many perspectives about this. There are different schools of thought about assessment, but here are some of the things that I just like to share. So first, a very quick review about validity and reliability. I think these are very, very important words to us. And I think as educators, as teachers, we have somehow used these words a lot of times. But just to keep us all on the same page, validity and reliability. What are they? Reliability is the consistency of the assessment in this case. And validity is that it means that it is testing what it is supposed to test. So in other words, reliability, very simply, is that assessment, if it were to be taken by different groups of students with different sorts of abilities, their performance should be more or less the same because they should be consistent in the measurement of what they're supposed to measure, right? On the other hand, validity is that if, let's say, our lesson is to test the uh, what they know about, let's say, the the Industrial Revolution, then the assessment should focus on that. And it should not go to World War One and then biglang may World War Two and then biglang may Cold War, diba? Or biglang merong Dark Ages. And so it becomes very confusing that the assessment is not actually testing what it is supposed to be testing. Okay? So the goal, of course, of assessment is to be both valid and reliable. Meaning, those students who do not understand the lesson should of course do quite poorly in that assessment, and students who understand the lesson should do well in that assessment. Syempre, you will say, oh nga, hindi ba dapat? Oo nga, totoo. However, we might have found ourselves in a situation when we created or we designed an assessment and then the results are very erratic. We have students who are doing well and did very poorly in that assessment. On the other hand, we have students who are not doing so well and did very, very well in that assessment. So what does that mean? Maybe we need to review the assessment. Baka yung type ng assessment pwedeng medyo laruin or medyo hulaan. Kaya iba-iba yung lumalabas na results ng mga tao. Okay, so again, our goal in creating assessments and evaluating assessments, all the more evaluating, is we want to make sure that the created assessment is both valid and reliable. Which means that how do we do that? We have a few more specific guidelines that we'd like to share. But first, what are some examples of assessment techniques? Of course, we have the paper and pencil or pen and paper tests. We have oral exams. We have assessments of performance. We have assessments of products, actual created products, for example, observations. Okay, sometimes if let's say you're a physical education teacher, a PE teacher, and you watch your students perform their drills, that's an observation. That's a type of observation assessment. Retrospective ratings, they'd like to, you think back about their performance and you rate them about it. Or let's say, when we give for some of us who may give our students, let's say, homeroom grade or conduct grade. So these are retrospective ratings. We give them a grade or a rating for a performance or for a behavior over a certain period of time. And of course, portfolios. Okay, so we don't have too much time to be able to discuss all of them. I will just discuss a few things or share about a few things. And of course, there will be others that we can talk about maybe next time. So first, the most common, of course, are our paper and pen tests or pen and paper tests. For our pen and paper tests, again, there are so many kinds, but I just like to highlight a few things. So first, our short answer items, short answer essays, or maybe essay questions, a more substantial essay question. And for structured response or what we call as objective tests, we have binary choice items such as true or false, or we have our multiple choice items, and we have our matching type assessments. So again, these are not the only ones that are available. So just to clarify that, these are examples only, and I just picked a few that we can look at. And again, the principles will be more or less the same when we go through all of these as we evaluate and look at assessments. So, what are some of the steps that I suggest we use when we evaluate assessments? So, first, we review the test or the assessment vis-a-vis the test blueprint. In some cases, we call it the table of specifications. Diba? When we create our exams, we usually start with the table of specifications. What are the things in different schools? The table of specs, shortcut, table of specs may look different, 'di ba? Iba-iba sa atin kasi we follow certain practices or we are looking for certain things. So again, the table of specs may look different in different institutions, but I think what's important is you have something like that so that when the test is created, that serves as the guide. So the table of specs is the first thing that's created. So you create table of specifications. What do we want to measure? How will this be measured? How many items? How many marks, if ever? So for when we evaluate assessments, the first thing we do is we look for that document. Where is the table of specifications? And then let's look at the existing assessment and compare and say, okay, they match. Second, ensure that the stimulus material is appropriate and that the question or instructions will elicit the expected response. Now, the stimulus material here is very broad. It can be the question itself, or it can be a text that is given beforehand, or a problem, or an input, or a video, let's say, that will be shown to them before they answer a few questions. So again, just a generic term there. So when we look at the assessment, what is the stimulus material? What is the question? What is the text? Is that appropriate? And will it elicit the expected response that we want? Next, of course, check that the questions match the expected answers. I think it's also very important that when we create our assessments, we also indicate our expected answer. Hindi lang sa math or sa science, for example, na isolve natin yung problem, tapos ito yung expected answer. That needs to happen in all the different subjects. So even if it's an essay, so when we ask a question, an essay question, we need to ourselves, to teachers, we need to explicitly state what is it that we expect the students to answer given what they know and given what they went through with all the formative assessments that we made them do. So again, check that the questions will match the expected answers. Diba? Hindi yung, mamaya the question, and also you look at the grade level that we're asking, diba? So when you ask something of a grade 2 or 3 student, iba ang expectation when you ask a similar question in grades 11 or 12, right? Next, check that the options for multiple choice items, for example, check the options. You don't just check the stimulus material or the main question, but you also check yung choices. and check the scoring guides or the rubrics for every item or for the marks, for the marking scheme. So again, these are some steps when we evaluate. So these are general steps first that you can look at. Now, of course, we don't want our assessments to just be testing lower order or rote memory or rote skills, but rather we want things to be measuring higher level, higher order thinking. So how do we do that? We consider the stimulus. The stimuli or the stimulus should be lifelike as much as we can, as realistic or as close to life as possible. And questions should also be about novel items, not those provided in textbooks and discussed in class. Diba? So for example, geography. If you say, if you have a question that says, the sun rises in the blank, diba? It's a very, very straightforward answer. There's nothing else that they can think of, or there's no other imagination or creativity that will come to that, right? So it's very rote also. Maybe that can be used in one of your formative or very simple first question answers. But the moment they know that the sun rises in the east, there's nothing else. But if you want that to be more application, let's say you're testing map reading skills, then you can give a scenario. So for example, um, Exxon is went with his parents to try to look at a new house, and the neighbor says that the sun is toward the sunrise is in this direction. So then look for that. So identify where is that. So it will be good, diba? That they will be able to test. They should know that the sun rises in the east. So will the house be facing the morning sun or will the house be facing afternoon sun? Right? So it's not novel. It's novel. It's not very just textbook or discussed in class. Questions should also need to be worded so that they require higher level thinking. So again, the way that we ask our questions should be, of course, age appropriate and again, appropriate to the context of our students. And consider the use of progressive items. Sorry. Progressive meaning that it does not just it's an ongoing, right, item, not a very always just focus on the past or just a straightforward fact. Okay, and supplement the items with probing questions, and these are things for essay, for example, or for even observations or reports, oral defense, right? Okay, now some more concrete examples now of evaluating structured response items. So here are some steps that we can use to evaluate multiple choice items. So first, identify the correct or the best answer. That is always the first thing that we do. So when you look at the questions, the existing questions, first you look at what is the correct answer. And let's make sure that it is stated correctly and in correct grammatical form. Then let's check the question. Check the stimulus. As much as possible, the form of the stimulus should be consistent also. So as much, if let's say you have 10 multiple choice answers, multiple choice questions, let's try to make as much as possible the stimulus all uniform. So do we want sentence completion or do we want question form? Sentence completion meaning, for example, multiple choice, for multiple choice questions to be valid, they have to be then A, B, C, or D. That's sentence completion. Question naman is, what important characteristics do we need to look for when we are talking about multiple choice questions? So that's question. So let's make the choices or the stimulus material stems, so we call it STEM sometimes, uniform. Check that the questions and the options, of course, require higher order. Identify or point out common errors and misunderstandings. Or, and also because we need to create good distractors that would appeal to students who have one or more of those misunderstandings. And again, it is not to confuse the students, but rather to ensure that later on they will know, okay, I made a mistake here because I used this wrong understanding. So later on they will know, hindi, this is not how I should think anymore. This is not the right way of thinking. Or if it were a math problem, we know this is where most likely they will do this. Albawa, they will simplify this part or they will combine this or they'll add this and this na hindi pa dapat. Then one of the options, the wrong option, should be something like that. So later on they will realize I should not do this. And they should follow the guidelines in writing good multiple choice questions. And what are these? One, that the structures should be the same in the grammatical form as the correct and best answer. Meaning, when we've already seen, hinanap natin na saan yung best or correct answer, dapat parallel yun. Same form, same grammatical form, even with the other choices. Otherwise, it will be very obvious. Either obvious na tama or obvious na mali. So the student does not have to think. Will only look for saan yung iba yung naiba, 'di ba? Kumanta ng alin-alin ang naiba, tas tanggalin lang niya 'yon without thinking about it. Of course, we also want to avoid giveaways. Make sure that all options are plausible, are related, pero hindi naman na para lang matrick, no? Not trick questions, but to, again, make sure that the students are able to differentiate really, especially between and among different contexts. And we look at that particularly through the context of the students. Halimbawa, their vocabulary. We need to also be conscious of the vocabulary that they have, the level of vocabulary that they have. And then have other teachers answer the test and see if they get the correct or the best answer. I think many of us, if not all of us, would do this, but it's a very important step that we cannot neglect. And then, according to some assessment experts, they say we avoid none of the above, all of the above, and the both A and B options. Because rather than testing what they know or they don't know, usually these questions get to be confusing. And rather than testing what really is supposed to be tested, they become trick questions, so to speak. So again, not saying that we cannot use them, especially if there are really items which are appropriate for this, but as much as possible to avoid them. And then arrange the options from shortest to longest. So of course, this is some people will say it's not very relevant, but I think very important is so that whatever happens, your choices will be random. Kasi mamaya subconsciously, we always put the correct answer in letter A or letter B or letter D. Diba? But if the options are arranged from shortest to longest, then most likely your choices will really be randomized. Then, of course, be mindful of capitalization and punctuation marks. Very, very simple. When we evaluate, we also look at this. Diba? Tama ba? Pantay-pantay ba? Or ma-obvious kung saan yung tama kasi naka-all caps. Diba? Sana hindi naman gagawin yun, giveaway. Diba? So, just an example. For example, these are questions for PE, physical education. So, based on what we talked about earlier, okay, we don't have the chance to really engage and discuss. I'll just show you these two questions, and in your mind, identify how can you improve on these questions based on what we shared earlier. So I'll just give you maybe 30 seconds to look at these questions and try to remember what we talked about earlier. So it's also a good break for a while, to break for a while and try to let things also sink in. Okay. So may mga naisip ba tayo? So example lang, no? Let's just go through some. So number one. So number one, what can happen to an athlete who does not warm up properly before a game? Sabi, letter A, he risks getting an injury such as a sprain. B, he risks losing the game. C, both A and B. And D, none of the above. Diba? Hindi ba sobrang nakakalito yung tanong? Dahil may both A and B tapos may none of the above pa. They actually, in a way, cancel each other out. Diba? So parang ang hirap ng question in that sense. Rather than focusing on the correct answer, medyo nakakalito siya. Diba? So those are the things, some examples. So again, the basic guidelines that we shared with you can be used to evaluate questions like these. Now, some guidelines in preparing binary choice or true or false items. Some points lang to consider. First, avoid broad statements. Example, engaging in physical activity makes a person healthy. It's a very broad statement. Parang wala ka namang mamamali dyan, di ba? How can you go wrong with that? And what are you really testing? What knowledge about it are we testing? Second, avoid qualifiers. Swimming is the only aerobic exercise that makes people lose weight, right? So by putting only, it's actually very, in a way, very obvious that usually when you put only, it's either obviously true or obviously false yan. Diba? Kasi for example, ito obviously false because swimming is not the only sport. Diba? So, when we put qualifiers, it makes the question quite obviously one or the other. Third, avoid double negatives. So, not working out regularly is disadvantageous to an athlete's performance. Nakakalito. Ano ba siya? True ba siya or false? Diba? Alam natin na yung idea is working out. So, pwede namang diretso. Working out regularly is advantageous to an athlete's performance. Right? So, again, the goal is not to confuse the student, but to make sure that they know what is supposed to be known. Next, avoid long, complicated sentences. Swimming, first recognized as an Olympic sport in Egypt, is a team sport that requires scoring. There are so many items or elements in this statement that can either be true or false. And so, the student will really not be sure, alin ba ang tinicheck ko dito? Yung history ba ni swimming na nag-start sa Egypt? Or the what type of exercise or sport is swimming? Na team sport ba siya? Na may kailangang scoring. So, ang dami, di ba? So many items. And again, chances are, long, complicated sentences like this, isa lang ang mali, syempre, false na. So, what do we want the students to really know? And then last, avoid opinion-based questions. So, volleyball is the most popular sport among teenage boys. Paano kung hindi sa kanya yung totoo? Di ba? Tsaka, according to whom? Right? Maybe, buti pa sana kung according to an article that was stated, it is considered to be ganyan. So, pwede yon. But if it's a blanket true or false question, it's hard to answer. Okay, so here are some guidelines. Again, when we look at the true or false questions or binary choice questions of an existing item or test that we created or that we see, here are some things that we can use or look at to improve those questions. Now, the third one that we talked about is matching exercises or yung matching type, very basic. No? Parang isip natin, matching type, padali lang naman gawin yan. But actually, creating matching type questions, we will need a lot more effort in preparing and preparation also, such that we at least try to limit all items to a single type of relationship and content area. So if, for example, we would like to classify certain items or certain things. So classification of, let's say, plants. So when we come up with a question or a few items for matching type, they should all be part of that general type of relationship. Hindi pwedeng iba-iba because it becomes very confusing. Hindi pwedeng dahil lang may relationship, yung A and B, nasa matching type na siya. Dapat matched yon. Magkakapareho yon, more or less, when we are testing something. It's also important in your instructions to indicate how often an option can be used. You can say you can repeat answers or answers may not be repeated. Again, hindi kasi siya trick question. Diba? It's not going to be part na pwede yung student pa ang pahuhulain natin. You should know, diba? Minsan tinatanong ng students, teacher, can we repeat answers? And ang sagot natin ay, that's part of the test, or you should know. Well, actually, in a way they should, but that's not part of the test, right? We tell them explicitly so that it does not confuse them anymore. And so they know na may isang answer, 1:1 lang siya. As much as possible, let's keep each set of matching items short. Hindi yung sobrang complicated para malilito na siya kung ano yung tinatanong. Indicate in the headings and the directions the basis for the match. What are we looking for? What relationship do they have? So for example, you say, identify the color of the item in terms of something like this. So alam nila na yung hinahanap natin ay yung relationship ng color at something. Okay? Then order responses logically. They say the easiest way and the most logical way of ordering responses in matching type is alphabetical order. So make all your choices, your column A all alphabetical, column B all alphabetical para random yung pag-aayos. Then, keep all items in a set together on the same page. Very important to, very practical to, pero ang hirap kasing mag-test ng matching type kung yung kakalahati ng choices nasa ibang page. 'Di ba? Pag ganun ang ganun yung test paper. Or even kung online test is scroll up and scroll down natin. So, as much as possible, very basic ito, but it helps help the students not be anxious and focus on the test rather than other things. And have at least one more option than you have items, especially if they cannot repeat answers. Okay? So have one more option para hindi sobrang obvious. Okay? Now, example ito. So I just grabbed this randomly from the internet. So here are the premises, the responses. So I'll give you another 15 to 20 seconds just thinking about what we talked about earlier. How can we improve on this type of assessment? Okay. So I think one way here, 'di ba? Walang instructions, 'di ba? So dapat very important yung identify the person who is being referred to in column A and write the answer from column B. Answers may not be repeated or there is no repetition of answers. So something like that. And then column A, column B. Right? Tapos sabi natin, 'di ba, yung instructions as much as possible kung kayang ay yung both columns can be as much as possible be arranged in a logical manner. So maybe alphabetical order. Tama naman ito dahil may extra siya as we mentioned earlier. 4 questions, 5 choices. So at least there's an extra item. Okay, so these are some examples that you can look at. Very basic. But of course, content-wise, of course, the teachers will know better. Now, how about unstructured response items? Earlier, we talked about evaluating structured response. We talked about multiple choice. We talked about binary choice or true or false. And we talked about matching type or matching options. Then this next one is evaluating unstructured response items. So when we evaluate unstructured response, these are some of the essay items, whether it's a short answer essay or a full essay. Identify in advance which variables will be considered in scoring and indicate these. Again, very important, the scoring guide or the rubrics. When we create the question, and later on us, when we evaluate the question, we identify nasaan ang scoring guide. What are we looking for here? Because we want to make sure that we go to the next, the questions really ask what is expected. At hindi may tinatanong na iba pala yung isasagot. So, do the questions ask about major concepts or principles? Right? Not very specific. Kasi kung very specific at one word or two word answers lang, there's no point using an unstructured response item. You might as well just use either a fill in the blank or a multiple choice, 'di ba? Kasi nga wala namang kailangang i-explain. But the reason why we use unstructured responses is because we want the students to be able to elaborate a bit more, whether it's a short answer or a full essay. We also want students or questions to require students to apply their knowledge, not simply report facts. They also want them to define the task. Do the questions define the task as completely and as specifically as possible? Diba? The question should be able to clarify what is expected of the student. So when you say, for example, in 100 words, explain how so and so and so and so was able to do this. Okay. Then as much as possible, ask many short specific questions rather than a few general questions. Lalo na kung mga short answer essays and we want to be able to check certain things along the way, pwede namang short answer. Hindi naman kailangan one big thing. Or just 2 or 3 na sobrang vague that they don't actually test what we want them to test, or we don't know anything about it. We don't get anything from the answers of the students. They can be very, very generic in their answers, and they can be correct, diba, in their answers. Like, for example, you ask, uh, in what way was the world is in what way was World War One, or how did World War One affect the world? One big question. Sobrang daming pwedeng isagot, di ba? It can be very specific, it can be very generic, and what aspect? Economic effects ba? Di ba? Humanitarian effects, cultural effects. So ano ba yung hinahanap natin? Okay, now, just a last note on evaluating and assessing multimedia assessments. I think your second session this month, you talked about integrating technology into the assessments. So we want to integrate technology, especially in the situation that we have right now. We found how technology can actually be integrated in the lessons and even in the assessments. That's one good thing that we got from this experience of being um, online, through our education because of COVID. So just a few items, just a few points for us to evaluate and assess multimedia assessments, and also performance tasks. Kasabay ko na. So when we talk about performance tasks, we are actually creating performance tasks as an assessment because we want authenticity and transfer. Authenticity meaning authentic, it approximates real life as much as possible. Of course, there are still limitations, but we'd like it to approximate real life as much as possible. And there should be transfer. So in simple terms, what does transfer mean? Transfer means that a student is able to apply what he or she learned in the lesson to other contexts, not just the specific context of the lesson. So, in a very practical way, for example, we are teaching them, let's say, narrative writing. They can apply that not just in a specific narrative writing in English, but narrative writing when they write a narrative in their, let's say, social science class or their science class. When they talk about their experiment, they narrate how they went through an experiment. So that's transfer. They are able to apply their knowledge and skills in a specific subject area into other aspects of their learning and even in their lives. So, performance tasks measure authenticity and transfer. So, also, we would like to focus on the 21st century skills. So, this is very familiar to us. There have been some revisions along the way, but I think very important are the 21st century skills that you would like to also develop in our students. And that's the reason why we create performance tasks also. There's a trend now to move towards performance tasks. Yes, the pen and paper tests may still be important at some point, but we do not stop there. We move towards preparing performance tasks. And one very famous framework that we know of in terms of preparing performance tasks is the GRASPS framework. I will not go through each one, this one very in detail now, because I think this is something quite familiar to us. But this is one way for us to create performance tasks. Create a performance task using the GRASPS framework. So what does the GRASPS framework do? It helps assessments become more authentic because the context is more in the real world. And it hopes to address more realistic problems. And also, because it's more realistic, the options, the insights that the students can draw from their experiences and from their lessons are also more varied. And it's not very textbook in that sense. And because there's an audience, A of GRASPs is particularly audience, we would like to have a realistic audience as much as possible. So even if it's not the actual audience, no, we know it's an exercise, but because the students are catering towards a specific audience, then they address their assessments, or they prepare their assessment in that way. And task as a genuine and relevant purpose. And of course, the task is messy enough. There's room for messiness because that's how life is, right? Hindi naman ang text natin kasi minsan straightforward. Hindi naman ganun ang life, 'di ba? Maraming mga pumapasok na mga sometimes concerns, sometimes curveballs, or sometimes different concerns that yes, will make us a little bit confused, but that's really how it is. And we want to be able to make use of our knowledge, the students' knowledge and skills to move forward. Therefore, performance tasks, again, focus on authenticity and transfer. And here is where technology plays an important role. Because right now, all the more, technology is really part of the way we do things, right? Can you imagine yourself even in one day doing something without going through the entire day without using any form of technology at all? Diba? So, um, technology is here to stay and we embrace it and we would like to make the most out of it. So here are some possible roles and audiences. I think this is readily available. You can identify it. So many things. So when we are looking at assessments, when we look at a grasps or a performance task, the first thing we ask is, sino ang audience at ano ang role na tinitake ng student? Appropriate ba? Match ba? 'Di ba? Yun yung titignan natin pag binabasa natin yung performance task na ginawa or nagawa natin. Appropriate ba yung role? Or baka naman mas bagay ang ibang role, 'di ba? Or realistic ba yung role? Or masyadong it becomes too either too close to their own experience na there's nothing else that they can do, or too far off naman na wala naman silang idea how to be that person. Hindi din nila masasagot, right? On the other hand, here are some possible products and performances. So again, the role and the audience are appropriate. Match din ba sila sa product or performance na kailangang ipagawa? Diba? Kunwari, you say, oh, okay, you stick to your role is you are a grade 8 student who is going to present to your school administrators about a certain something. Tapos yung product na hinihingi ay isang um, full-blown documentary that includes uh, editing, etc., etc. Eh kung grade 8, paano niya gagawin yun, di ba? Appropriate ba na ganun talaga yung product and performance? So tayo ang makakasagot nun. So as someone who's evaluating a form of assessment, yan yung kailangan natin tignan. Appropriate ba? And one very important thing, litmus test to evaluate performance tasks is for transfer and effective ba yung tool, are these two questions. Can the students do well in the assessment even if they did not understand the subject matter? And second question, can the students fail the assessment even if they understood the lesson? If the answer to both questions as you are evaluating a certain performance task is yes, then there is a need to review or evaluate the assessment. Among others, you may want to review, tama ba yung use ng technology? That's one thing to look at. Or, as a whole, tama ba yung role or yung audience or yung product? Matched ba? Because if both yes ito, ibig sabihin the assessment may have some concerns. Diba? Kasi what do we want students who did not understand a certain subject matter to do well in an assessment? There's something wrong. On the other hand, those naman who really understood the lesson pero failed the assessment, then hindi rin tama yun, di ba? So for example, very basic lang, your assessment, your science class, and you're talking about the parts of the tooth, for example. Yung enamel, di ba? Yung root, etc., etc. Tapos yung assessment natin is, let's say, create a diagram or an actual visual representation of a tooth using clay, for example. Eh, may batang hindi masyado magaling gumawa nung creative part nung yung clay. So, mali-mali yung gawa niya doon. Pero alam niya kung ano yung root parts ng tooth. Pwede ba siyang bumagsak sa assessment? Diba? Pwede. Pero alam niya. So, mali yun. Hindi bagay yung assessment. On the other hand, you have a student naman, ang galing-galing, gumawa nun, pinagawa niya, naghumingi siya ng tulong or gumawa siya doon, naayos-ayos niya lahat yon. Pero, in the end, hindi naman niya memorize o hindi naman niya pala alam o hindi niya naintindihan yung functions ng mga parts na yun. Alam lang niya na nandun. Tama ba yung assessment? So again, this is a very important tool in evaluating assessment. What we call is as the litmus test to evaluating the performance tasks. So, just to wind down, some helpful tips in terms of creating performance tasks. They say, although we usually create it using the grasp format, it might also be good. It depends on your decision here to show it in a paragraph form to the students. So situation siya rather than GRASPS. Okay, so again, it depends also on your school decision and school administrators. After the teachers design their assessments, it will also help if others can take a look at it, and that's why we have evaluation of assessments. In our school, for example, we have assessment presentations where the teachers also present their assessments to their team members as part of a professional learning community or conversations, and at the same time to give input and feedback about the assessment. In that discussion, teachers will say, oh, parang baka pwedeng mas ganito yung form ng assessment. So we are already evaluating and improving the assessment even before we roll it out to the students. In our case also, the computer teachers can present their learning competencies so that the teachers can attach to those technological competencies. And always prepare exemplars for students and make them do their self-evaluation, because that also feeds us information about the assessment. That's also one way of doing post-assessment evaluation. And of course, when we look at our assessments and evaluate the assessments that we've created or that someone else created, do we ask ourselves, age appropriate ba ito? Bagay ba ito sa grade 1 o grade 2 na estudyante natin? Or bagay ba ito sa grade 5 or grade 6? And bagay ba yung use of technology? Or minsan naman, kung hindi naman ginamitan ng technology at very plain lang siya, basta na-measure niya yung kailangan niyang i-measure, okay lang din naman, di ba? So here are just some references that I used in putting together all of these. Okay. So there. And then maybe you can write down a key takeaway that you have from this session. You can just note it down so that you can use it in your practice in the next few weeks, months, and even years. So there. Thank you very much for your participation and for listening this afternoon. So are there any questions or clarifications that you would like to ask or comments?
And thank you so much, Sir Exxon, for that really comprehensive discussion, no, on evaluating assessments. Teachers, we now have time for questions. Okay. Sir Exxon, the first question of the teachers talaga is that can they have a copy of your presentation? Yun kagad yung unang lumabas na question sa chat kanina.
Sure, I'll just convert it to PDF and then I'll send it to you, Franco.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, noted, sir. And then we'll facilitate teachers in the sharing of Sir Exxon's presentation. Okay. By the way, no, I've been under Sir Exxon for the longest time, and really, no, our assessments are well designed because Sir Exxon is always there, to guide us in designing our assessments. Okay, yes. And of course, no, syempre, nakita ko na naman, Sir Exxon, yung ating litmus test, no? Always yan, no? Very consistent yan si Sir Exxon whenever we design assessments. Yes, Teacher Zahara de Langalen will be giving the attendance link later, no? The evaluation link. Okay. For the meantime, yan. Pero siguro, Sir Exxon, ano lang, no? Since wala pa tayong question from the audience, okay, might as well also ask a question, no? And this is something about on the use of when we are having like an unstructured assessments or items, and there are like open-ended answers or expected answers. Okay, how do we make sure na kahit gaano kadami yung possible answers, no, that we are still being able to assess what we intend to assess?
So I think in those cases, very important pa rin is to identify what direction we want our students to go, 'di ba? Kunwaring maraming posibleng it can be siguro many possibilities, but at least siguro what we can narrow down is what direction do we want them to take? Do we want them to more or less go towards this direction of, let's say, saying, knowing, for example, that this event happened and therefore this is where we would like to lead our students towards. Ito yung general direction na pupuntahan nila. And maybe yun yung lagi natin tinatanong, 'di ba? Sa essay questions, mahirap gumawa ng question. Hindi din tayo pwede gumawa ng question na walang right or wrong answer. Kasi paano natin i-grade? So, okay na lahat, 'di ba? But not so much the right or wrong answer there. Ang check natin yung argument nila, 'di ba? Kunwaring halimbawa medyo parang opinion based siya, dapat they need to identify certain proof. So for example, baka kailangan natin sa marking natin not to say na ito yung sasagutin nila, pero they should show proof of, let's say, one source from, kunwari sa Soksay, 'di ba? One
Yes.
example from this source, or one example from this, from classroom learning or something like that. Para
And dito
may
yeah.
rubrics tayo.
Tama sir, dito rin pumapasok yung importance ng rubrics natin. Kaya pag mga unstructured test na. Siguro second question, no, kasi wala pa ako nakitang question from our chat, no. All appreciation. Thank you, sir. This very helpful mga compliment comments, no, from our teachers. So isa pang question ko siguro is that, what's your opinion? Kasi syempre, ng 21st century learning, 21st century assessments as well, and more that we are pushing for student choice and voice. Okay? Kaya lang whenever we do this, no, for example, nagdi-differentiate tayo ng content, nagdi-differentiate tayo ng process, and of course, no, yung output ng mga students natin. Siguro ano yung, and of course, no, this is something that our teachers really have to do kasi nga 21st century learning, increasing student choice and voice. Pero siguro tip lang siguro, Sir Exxon, for our teachers, even if we're giving our students that much choice and voice whenever they show like output, no, or their learning outcomes, ano yung dapat tandaan ng mga teachers para hindi pa rin ganun kahirap i-manage? Kasi nga, for example, meron kang 40 students, tapos all of them, no, will have like choices of how to like show their learning. Ano yung siguro mga reminders lang siguro for our teachers?
I think student voice and choice very important, no. But again, given the context that we have, I think it's also important to take into consideration the context of the different schools that we are part of, and even the different teachers who are available to teach, no. And so one thing that we can have is maybe to we can find, in terms of assessments, we can have assessments that can really have student choice and voice and choice. They can exercise that. So for example, baka in some of our formative assessments, we can just post a question and say, answer this in a way that you would like to do it. In a recent conference that I attended, no, very interesting. It's not a formative, it's not an assessment per se, but it can be a formative assessment. So you ask a question and you say, for example, I'd like us to identify the important characteristics of a Renaissance man. Siyempre, history yung ginagamit nating example, Mr. Dun, ano? Kunwari, ang example of what are the main characteristics of the Renaissance man or a modern day Renaissance man? Kunwari, ganyan, di ba? Yun lang yung tanong natin. So, how do they do that? They can answer that in either a drawing, or they can just list down their answers. Or for those who are a little bit more creative, they can make a poem to highlight the characteristics. And in that way also highlights student voice and choice. Pero wala masyadong strong bearing on the assessment itself, diba? Now, in terms of really graded assessments, I think depends on the readiness of the institution, as mentioned earlier. I think you can still set certain parameters para hindi maligaw yung um, kumbaga hindi ma-distract masyado yung mga tao kung sa ginagawang kung ano-ano, 'di ba, iba-iba, then you can just say maybe in the form of, or with the possible for in the form of, let's say, um, either a video or may mga suggested. Baka yun yung naisip kong pwedeng gawin natin so that the students can also have a guide para hindi rin naman out of nothing, 'di ba? Kung
Yeah.
saan-saan.
Parang meron pa rin tayong mga like mga key skills, key knowledge na talagang ina-assess, tina-target, no, despite
Mm.
no increasing student choices and voices. Ito. Okay, siguro Sir Exxon, may question kasi dito from Teacher Lailani Gamban, ano? And ito actually yung question ko din. Your opinion on ChatGPT, no? And in general, the AI tools, no, that's been being being prevalent right now. Siguro sir, in both perspective, no, how kasi wala so far right now 'no, sa Xavier School hindi pa tayo naglalabas talaga 'no, ng guidelines natin regarding the ChatGPT, but I think we're going to have soon kasi, pumapasok na 'tong ChatGPT na 'to and the AI tools 'no. So, in the perspective of the students 'no, ano yung opinion niyo about AI tools, Sir, Exxon? And also on the other hand naman, ano naman yung tingin niyo 'no, impact nito sa teaching or sa ano natin, sa mga educators natin?
Okay, so first off, ChatGPT, from the perspective of the teachers, it's a nightmare in a sense if we think about how ChatGPT can answer our tests. Siyempre, that aspect, nightmare. But at the same time, I think ChatGPT can be used for certain ways, in certain ways by educators. So for example, very clearly, let's say kunwari grammar lesson, and we'd like to check for grammar or syntax, and we make ChatGPT answer a certain question and say, oh, answer ChatGPT will answer, ask ChatGPT a question, and they come out with the lesson. And then we analyze that. How did ChatGPT use that? Or tama ba yung gamit? Appropriate use ba of a certain grammatical tool or certain syntax that is used? So that's one way. Second, we can also use it to verify facts, di ba? If our lesson, let's say, again, going back to history, is verifying facts, ask ChatGPT a question. Is, let's say, um, you can make something up muna and then come up with random things. Diba? For example, is Franco Adun the best teacher in the world? Diba? Kunwari, sasagot si ChatGPT. Ngayon, ang goal natin as educators is to guide our students. Oh, ito yung argument ni ChatGPT. Tama ba? What proof do we have that yes, it is so? So that's an example. So those are, I'm just an example for how we can help our, as teachers, we can make use of ChatGPT, which goes towards the students naman. I think more importantly, we need to help our students be aware and conscious of what ChatGPT can do and how it should be used. And yun yung pwede nating maging lesson na it's not meant to replace things. Kasi if they realize, katulad ng exercise natin kanina, if they realize na, ay teka, flawed din ang argument ni ChatGPT kasi hindi pa siya nag-iisip, wala pa siyang judgment, it just puts together facts, 'di ba? In a coherent and smooth way. So pag binasa mo ng without thinking, in most cases, may isip mo, ay, oo nga, no, tama nga naman siya. Or minsan, tama naman talaga siya. Pero kasi, may judgment na kailangan pumasok. And that's what the humans, still, as humans, can do. So yun yung naisip ko, we can, for the teachers, we can make use of it the most way that we can, kumbaga gamitin natin. For the students naman, to help guide them as to how it can be used properly. And of course, to tell them that ChatGPT is not meant to be the easy way out. Now, in terms of constructing tests, I think that's really the challenge. That yun yung, we go back to that question earlier that we do not just ask very novel items. We ask novel items which takes into consideration certain contexts, which in that sense, kahit papano, mahihirapan si ChatGPT or kung makasagot man siya, malalaman natin na teka lang, off yata yung context nito. Yung sinasabi niya kasi hindi naman appropriate. 'Di ba? So parang ganun. So of course, still the answers are not very clear to us because we are still trying to find out more about ChatGPT and what it can actually do and what it cannot do. But definitely an important discussion to have.
Yes, thank you, Sir, Sir Exxon. And then definitely something siguro personal Sir Exxon, ang perspective namin is that we have to start also exploring ChatGPT ourselves, teachers. Alamin natin yung capabilities niya. Ako lagi kong kausap si ChatGPT everyday. Nag-uusap kami just to see na ano yung mga possibilities. I found out na nagtatagalog si ChatGPT, so pwede ako magtanong ng mga Filipino questions. Meron din siyang limitations in terms of like mga facts and details, okay? Things like that, no? And siguro, Sir Exxon, reminders to our teachers na hindi na to bago sa atin, itong shift na to. If you remember, nung inintroduce si Google as a search engine, it also revolutionized education. Kasi nga yung access to information suddenly became accessible to everyone. Kasi nagbago din yung who's the source of information. Naging biglang si Google. So similar, I mean, again, this is going to be a catalyst once again. So embrace lang natin, tsaka let's see how it will once again change the face of education in the 21st century. Yan. Maraming salamat, Teacher Leilani, for that question. Okay? So with that, no, maraming salamat, teachers, for your questions. Okay? And of course, no, to Sir Exxon, no, for sharing your time, no, and your expertise in this topic, no, and leading us into this discussion. But of course, before we leave, no, and to end our session, Sir Exxon, is we'd like to present this simple, no, a certificate, okay, of appreciation, okay, to be respectfully awarded to Sir Exxon Ryan Yu for sharing his knowledge and expertise in the recently concluded webinar entitled Evaluating Assessments, Understanding Validity, Reliability, and Effectiveness of Assessments, awarded on March 25, na training duration of 1.5 hours, signed by Franco Nicolopiadon, Administrator of CAGA by Teachers Support. Maraming salamat ulit, Sir Exxon, for your time. And Sir Exxon, meron lang kami dito usual tradition sa aming mga speakers. We ask words of encouragement for you to end the session.
Okay, so unang-una salamat ulit Franco sa pag-imbita. It's really an honor to be with educators and it's an honor also to share some of the insights, ideas that I have based on my experience also. And so words of encouragement. So teachers, I think we all know that the challenge in front of us is a lot. There's a lot of challenges in front of us, especially with the new trends in technology. But I'd like to believe that the teacher really cannot be replaced because of a few things. One, uh, the mind, the human mind is still cannot still be replaced because that's something that technology, I think at this point still cannot do. 'Di ba? Yung how we can put together certain ideas, break apart certain ideas, that's really the human mind, and that's what we can bank on, and that's what we can impart our students. Second, diligence and effort is something that AI can never do and can never have. Um, it will churn out answers without much effort and maybe without much perseverance. It will do that. But our perseverance and effort is something that really technology cannot replace. And the last one is the love and the concern that we have for our students. And the love and concern that we receive back from our students is something irreplaceable. And I'm 100% sure of the last one, that it is really 100% something that cannot be replaced by any technology or by any new innovation. And that is why, as teachers, that is what really we can bank on. I think I'd like to believe all of us are in this profession because we have this great love for learning and this great love for students, which we will use to move us forward. Kung dun man lang tama tayo, hindi na tayo magkakamali. So thank you so much, Cheers.
Ang sarap pakinggan yun, Sir Exxon. Maraming salamat po ulit, Sir Exxon, for your time and then your expertise and your, of course, your words of wisdom for our teachers. Okay? So maraming salamat, Sir Exxon, and teachers, okay, will now share the evaluation link for you to get your certificates for today's session. Paalam po, Sir Exxon.
Salamat. I will go ahead. Thank you po. Bye-bye. Happy weekend, Cheers. Happy weekend, Franco.
So sir, teachers, ito na po yung evaluation link natin. Please evaluate this session at https://tinyurl.com/March Series 2023 E4. Okay? And teachers, by the way, next week na maglalabas na rin po kami ng mga details for our April series. Our April series will be centered on gamified education. So everything about gamification, gamifying education, game design and learning, all of those things that we'll be tackling on our April series next week. Next week, no? Hindi po tayo mag-start ng right off the bat no, ng April 1. Okay? So, pahinga po natin next week. And then we'll resume no, on the first week of April for our April series. No? Again, gamification in education. Okay? So, maraming salamat, teachers. And we'll see you again no, on a couple of weeks, no, in 2 weeks' time for our April series. Okay? Maraming salamat po and have a great day, teachers. Ingat po kayong lahat. Always be proud of being a teacher. Heads up high, teachers, and because you're doing and you're changing the world. Maraming salamat po.